Hello everyone, welcome to the next lecture in our physiology video lecture series. This particular lecture is titled Temperature Regulation. In this lecture, we will go through various forms or various mechanisms by which our body maintains a set point temperature and the various abnormal conditions that can arise when the set point temperature is not maintained. We will also look into the mechanisms of heat formation and heat loss in our body and how they are regulated in order to set our particular physiologic temperature, that is obviously that is close to 37 degrees Celsius. So let us get started. To start off, we will first look at normal body temperatures. In this particular schematic, we have a number of a representation of what exactly the normal temperature of a body should be, both measured orally and rectally. So first we'll look into the concept of core temperature and skin temperature. The temperature of the deep tissues of the body, that is the core of the body, remains very constant within plus minus 1 degree Fahrenheit or 0.6 degrees centigrade day in and day out, except when a person develops a febrile condition. That is when a person develops fever. The skin temperature, in contrast to core temperature, rises and falls with the temperature of the surroundings. The skin temperature is the important temperature when we refer to the skin's ability to lose heat to the surroundings. Thus, the core of our body, that is mainly the viscera inside our abdomen and the brain, temperature almost always remains constant with a very minute degree of change. But the temperature of our skin, as we know from day-to-day life, can change drastically from from increasing to a high temperature to dropping down to a low temperature as well. The core temperature is what is directly maintained by our temperature sensing and regulatory system, but that also affects the skin temperature. The skin temperature is really important when we are considering loss or gain of heat from the body to the surroundings, because it is the skin temperature that will determine in which way the heat will flow. So next we will look at the normal core temperature of a body. No single core temperature can be considered normal because measurements in many healthy people have shown a range of normal temperatures measured orally. As shown in the figure, from less than 97 degree Fahrenheit, which is 36 degrees Celsius, to over 99.5 degree Fahrenheit, which is around 37.5 degrees Celsius. The average normal core temperature is generally considered to be between 98 degree and 98.6 degree Fahrenheit when measured orally, and 1 degree Fahrenheit higher when measured rectally. If we will look carefully, 98 degree Fahrenheit and 98.6 degree Fahrenheit are the values that we most commonly associate when taking a temperature. When a patient is suffering from fever, if the temperature rises to say 100 degree Fahrenheit or higher, then we say that the person has a fever. And that is because obviously the range of normal temperature should be from 97 to 99.5 degree Fahrenheit. Here in the schematic itself, the various ranges of temperatures and how a normal human being can reach these temperature levels are shown. So the usual range of temperature is, as we have just seen, around 36 to 57.5 degrees Celsius or 97 degree Fahrenheit to about 99.5 degree Fahrenheit. But it can drop down to lower volume, lower temperatures during early morning or in a cold weather when there is a lot of the temperature of the surroundings has dropped down, and thus this causes heat flow from the body to the outside, and thus the temperature decreases. Or it can also increase during hard work or emotion or moderate exercise. when our body generates a lot of heat and thus the temperature rises. This occurs in can occur in a few normal adults, or many active children also show higher body temperature. And finally, a very high temperature of around 102 to 104 degree Fahrenheit can be seen during extremely strenuous exercise, or as more commonly seen during a febrile or feverish condition. So let us go forward. The body temperature increases during exercise and varies with temperature extremes of the surroundings, because the temperature regulatory mechanisms are not perfect. When excessive heat is produced in the body by strenuous exercise, the temperature can rise temporarily to as high as 101 degrees to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Conversely, when the body is exposed to extreme cold, the temperature can often fall to values below 96 degrees Fahrenheit. Next, let us look at how the body temperature is controlled by balancing heat production against heat loss. When the rate of heat production in the body is greater than the rate at which the heat is being lost, heat builds up in the body and the body temperature rises. Conversely, when heat loss is greater, both the body heat and body temperature decrease. So now let us look in detail how exactly heat production and heat loss are done by the body. We start off by the heat production by our body. Heat production is a principal byproduct of metabolism. That is, it is not essential that the body is trying to generate heat, but the various metabolic processes have generate heat by themselves. There are different factors that determine the rate of heat production. The most important of these factors are listed here. The first and most important factor is the basal rate of metabolism of all cells of the body, because the basal rate of metabolism is what judges the rate at which the metabolism occurs in all the cells, and thus also how much heat will be produced due to it. Next is the extra rate of metabolism caused by muscle activity, including muscle contractions caused by shivering. As we know, shivering is something that occurs when our body feels extremely cold, and it is essentially a heat production mechanism by which our body tries to maintain a higher temperature than the surroundings. This process is essentially one of those which is entirely dedicated to heat production. Next is the extra metabolism caused by effect of thyroxine, and to a less extent other hormones such as growth hormone and testosterone on the cells. The other causes can be extra metabolism caused by effect of epinephrine, norepinephrine, and sympathetic stimulation on the cells. Extra metabolism caused by increased chemical activity in the cells themselves, especially when cell temperature increases, can also be a reason of heat production. And finally, extra metabolism needed for digestion, absorption, and storage of food, which are clubbed together as the thermogenic effect of food, is also one of the reasons behind heat generation. As we see that some of major hormones like thyroxine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine are also related to heat production. Thyroxine is a major player in this because the thyroxine hormone is the one that determines the rate of metabolism in most cells. The effect and function of various hormones is something that we'll discuss in the later lectures on the endocrine system. But for now, it should be sufficient that these hormones are related to the increase in metabolism via either through direct biochemical means or by making the body respond to sympathetic stimulation and thus as a byproduct generate heat. Next, we move on to heat loss in the body. Most of the heat produced in the body is generated in the deep organs, especially in the liver, brain, heart, and various skeletal muscles during exercise. Then this heat is transferred from the deeper organs and tissues to the skin, where it is lost to the air and the surroundings. Therefore, the rate at which heat is lost is determined almost entirely by two factors. The first of these factors are how rapidly heat can be conducted from where it is produced in the body core to the skin, and how rapidly heat can then be transferred from the skin to the surroundings. One of the things that we have to discuss while discussing the heat lost by the body is the insulator system of the body, which prevents such heat loss. The skin, the subcutaneous tissue, and especially the fat of the subcutaneous tissues act together as a heat insulator for the body. The fat is important because it conducts heat only 1/3 as readily as other tissues and thus acts as a natural insulator. The insulation beneath the skin is an effective means of maintaining normal internal core temperature, even though it allows the temperature of the skin to approach the temperature of the surroundings. Essentially, the layers of fat and subcutaneous tissues make sure that the core body temperature is maintained and is isolated from the skin for most of the time, so that heat loss from the core to the surroundings via the skin cannot occur readily. For this reason, you can see that many of the organisms or animals that live in very cold conditions, such as in the polar climate, have a very thick layer of insulation in the form of fat on their bodies. Be it seals or the polar bears who live near the poles, they have evolved in such a way that they have a thick layer of fat under their skins in order to maintain their core body temperature and survive the harsh climate of the poles. Next, let us move on to blood flow to the skin. Blood vessels are distributed profusely beneath the skin. Especially important is a continuous venous plexus that is supplied by inflow of blood from the skin capillaries. That is shown by the figure, which is the network that is shown right here. In the most exposed areas of the body, the hands, the feet, and the ears, blood is also supplied to the plexus directly from the small arteries through a highly muscular arteriovenous anastomosis. The rate of blood flow into the skin venous plexus can vary tremendously, from barely above zero to as great as 30% of the total cardiac output. The rate of blood flow determines the efficiency of heat loss. And thus it is obvious that the rate of blood flow is one of the major things that is regulated in order to regulate the temperature, the heat lost from the skin. The role of blood here in heat loss is similar to that of coolant that is present in our air conditioners, where a coolant from where the blood carries heat from the core organs to the skin, from where it can be easily lost. Next, we look into the control of heat conduction to the skin by the sympathetic nervous system. Heat conduction to the skin by the blood is controlled by the degree of vasoconstriction of the arterioles and the arteriovenous anastomosis that supply blood to the venous plexus of the skin. This vasoconstriction is controlled almost entirely by the sympathetic nervous system in response to changes in body core temperature and changes in the environmental temperature. And thus, heat conduction via the blood flow to the skin is maintained by the sympathetic nervous system, and thus it is the major player in determining the rate of blood flow to the skin and thus the heat lost by the skin. Next, we will change gears a bit and talk about basic physics of how heat is lost from the skin surface radiation. As shown in the figure, in a naked person sitting inside at normal room temperature, about 60% of the heat lost is by radiation. So most of the heat lost is via radiation itself. Loss of heat by radiation means loss in the form of infrared heat rays, which is obviously a type of electromagnetic waves. The human body radiates heat rays in all directions. Heat rays are also being radiated from the walls of the rooms and other objects towards the body. Obviously, if the temperature of the body is greater than the temperature of the surroundings, a greater quantity of heat is radiated from the body than is radiated to the body. That is, if the temperature of the surroundings is greater than the temperature of the body, then heat will flow from the surroundings to the body. And if the temperature of the surroundings is lower than the temperature of one's body, then heat will flow from one's body towards the surroundings. The other methods via which the body can lose or gain heat is by conduction. As shown in the figure, only minute quantities of heat, only about 3%, are normally lost from the body by the direct conduction from the surface of the body to solid objects, such as a chair or a bed. Loss of heat by conduction to air, however, represents a sizable portion of the body's heat loss, about 15%, even under normal conditions. That is mainly because we are in contact with air with most of our surface area, and even though air is a very poor conductor of heat, it can, due to the massive surface area with which we are in contact with air, it is still able to remove such a huge chunk of heat from our body. Compared to that, conduction via solid surfaces can only occur with surfaces with which we are in physical contact with. And generally speaking, a cold surface is not something someone will be prone to be in contact with for a longer period of time. And thus, the conduction of heat and loss of heat via objects is a very small amount of the total heat loss by the body, only about 3%. Next, we talk about convection. The removal of heat from the body by convection air currents is commonly called heat loss by convection. Actually, the heat must first be conducted to the air and then carried away by convection air currents. As we know, convection occurs when a particular part of a fluid is being heated, and then this causes a motion in the fluid so that the heated portion of the fluid flows upwards, while the cooler portions of the fluid not in contact with the heat source go downwards, and hence the entirety of the fluid can help in heat loss. This is what happens during heat loss from a human as well. A small amount of convection almost always occurs around the body because of the tendency for air adjacent to the skin to rise as it becomes heated. Therefore, a new person seated in a comfortable room without gross air movements, about 15% of his or her total heat loss occurs by conduction to the air and then by air convection away from the body. Next is the phenomenon of evaporation. When water evaporates from the body surface, 0.58 calorie of 0.58 calorie of heat is lost for each gram of water that evaporates. Even when a person is not sweating, water still evaporates insensibly from the air, from the skin and lungs at a rate of about 600 to 700 milliliters per day. This causes continual heat loss at a rate of 16 to 19 calories per hour. This insensible evaporation through the skin and the lungs cannot be controlled for purposes of temperature regulation because it results from continual diffusion of water molecules through the skin and respiratory surfaces. However, loss of heat by evaporation of sweat can be controlled by regulating the rate of sweating. And sweating is a very important phenomenon which occurs in higher animals such as humans, which have allowed us to gain an evolutionary advantage over lower animals which can only have or which can only lose their heat by a process known as panting. This is something that we'll look into in later slides. Next, let us look at the phenomenon of evaporation combined with sweating. Evaporation is a necessary cooling mechanism at very high air temperatures. As long as skin temperature is greater than the temperature of the surroundings, heat can be lost by radiation and convection. But when temperature of the surroundings becomes greater than that of the skin, instead of losing heat, the body gains heat by radiation and convection. Under these conditions, the only means by which the body can rid itself of heat is by evaporation. And thus, evaporation is a major player in helping the body to lose heat in extremely hot environments. Sweating and its regulation by autonomic nervous system. Sweating is obviously something that will help in heat loss by evaporation in higher temperature conditions. Stimulation of the anterior hypothalamus preoptic area in the brain, either electrically or by excess heat, causes sweating. The nerve impulses from this area that cause sweating are transmitted in autonomic pathways to the spinal cord and then through the sympathetic outflow to the skin everywhere in the body. The sweat glands are innervated by cholinergic nerve fibers. These glands can also be stimulated to some extent by epinephrine and norepinephrine circulating in the blood. Now we'll look into in detail how exactly sweating occurs and the mechanism of sweat generation. So next we look into the mechanism of sweat secretion. In this particular figure, we can see a sweat gland that is present under our skin. In the figure, the sweat gland is shown to be a tubular structure consisting of two major parts. First is a deep subdermal coiled portion, which is right here, that secretes the sweat, and second is a duct portion that passes outward through the dermis and the epidermis of the skin. So, which is this duct that is shown right here, which connects the sweat gland to the skin. As is true in so many glands, the secretory portion of sweat secretes a fluid called the primary secretion or the precursor secretion. The concentrations of the constituents in the fluid are then modified as the fluid flows through the duct. The precursor secretion is an active secretory product of the epithelial cells lining the coiled portion of the sweat gland. Cholinergic sympathetic nerve fiber sending on or near the glandular cells elicit the secretion. The composition of the precursor secretion is similar to that of plasma, except that it does not contain any plasma proteins. The concentration of sodium is around 142 milliequivalents per liter, and that of chloride is about 104 milliequivalents per liter, which with much smaller concentrations of other solutes of the plasma. But these two concentrations of sodium and chloride are pretty much close to the normal plasma concentrations. As this precursor solution flows through the duct portion of the gland, it is modified by reabsorption of most of the sodium and chloride. When the sweat glands are stimulated only slightly, the precursor fluid passes through the duct slowly. In this instance, essentially all the sodium and chloride are reabsorbed and the concentration of each falls to as low as 5 milliequivalents per liter. This reduces the osmotic pressure of the sweat fluid to such a low concentration that most of the water is reabsorbed, which concentrates most other constituents. Therefore, at low rates of sweating, such constituents as urea, lactic acid, and potassium ions are usually very concentrated. Conversely, when the sweat glands are strongly stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system, large amounts of precursor secretions are formed, and the duct may reabsorb only slightly more than half the sodium chloride. Furthermore, the sweat flows through the glandular tubules so rapidly that little of the water is also reabsorbed. Thus, the other dissolved constituents of the sweat are only moderately increased in concentration. Urea is about twice the concentration as in plasma, lactic acid is 4 times, and potassium is about 1.2 times. Thus, when the sweat glands are strongly stimulated, majority of the function of sweating is in order to reduce the temperature of the skin's temperature by allowing larger and larger amount of water to be evaporated. At low concentrations, sweating can also act in order to excrete unneeded end products of metabolism such as urea and lactic acid. Next, we look into the regulation of body temperature and the role of the hypothalamus that is important in relation to the dysregulation. The temperature of the body is regulated almost entirely by nervous feedback mechanisms, and almost all these operate through temperature regulating centers located in the hypothalamus. For these feedback mechanisms to operate, there must also be temperature detectors to determine when the body temperature raises too high or too low. So we look into what the role of the anterior hypothalamic preoptic area is in the thermostatic detection of temperature. Experiments have shown that the centers for body temperature control are the preoptic area and the anterior hypothalamic nuclei of the hypothalamus. The anterior hypothalamic preoptic area has been found to contain large numbers of heat-sensitive neurons, as well as about 1/3 as many cold-sensitive neurons. These neurons are believed to function as temperature sensors for controlling body temperature. The heat sensitive neurons increase their firing rate 2 to 10-fold in response to a 10-degree rise in temperature. The cold sensitive neurons, by contrast, increase their firing rate when the body temperature falls. And thus, the relative rate of firing of these neurons is what effectively indicates the rise or fall in temperature in our body. When the preoptic area is heated, skin all over the body immediately breaks out in a profuse sweat, while the skin blood vessels over the entire body becomes greatly dilated. This is an immediate reaction to cause the body to lose heat, thereby helping to return the body temperature towards the normal. In addition, any excess body heat production is inhibited. Therefore, it is clear that the hypothalamic preoptic area has the capability to serve as the thermostatic body temperature control center. And essentially, this anterior preoptic hypothalamic area is what determines the set point temperature for our body and maintains it at that temperature. Next, we move to detection of temperature by receptors present in the skin. Although the signals generated by the temperature receptors of the hypothalamus are extremely powerful in controlling body temperature, receptors in other parts of the body play additional roles in temperature regulation. This is especially true of temperature receptors in the skin and in a few specific deep tissues of the body. The skin is endowed with both cold and warmth receptors. There are far more cold receptors than warmth receptors. In fact, 10 times as many in many parts of the skin. Therefore, peripheral detection of temperature mainly concerns detecting cool and cold temperatures instead of warm temperatures. When the skin is chilled over the entire body, immediate reflex effects are invoked and begin to increase the temperature of the body in several ways, which include by providing a strong stimulus to cause shivering, with a resultant increase in the rate of body heat temperature. Thus, essentially, shivering is the process by which our muscles vibrate at a low frequency in order to cause heat generation via friction. And thus, it is a very important mechanism by which our body can produce heat when required and when faced with a very cold temperature. Next process by which temperature can be increased is by inhibiting the process of sweating if this is already occurred. And finally, it can also occur by promoting skin vasoconstriction to diminish loss of body heat from the skin. As we have just seen that blood flow to the skin plays an important role in determining the heat that is lost from the body by carrying heat from the coat of the body to the skin in order to be lost. This blood flow can be regulated by the sympathetic nervous system, and a vasoconstriction occurs when the body is faced with a cool temperature. That is, there is less amount of blood that is allowed to flow to the flow under the skin, and thus it reduces the chance of heat loss via the skin. Next, we look into temperature receptors in deep body tissues and integration of the various temperature receptor signals by the posterior hypothalamus. So first we look into the deep body tissue receptors. Deep body temperature receptors are found mainly in the spinal cord, in the abdominal viscera, and in or around the great veins in the upper abdomen and the thorax. These deep receptors function differently from the skin receptors because they are exposed to the body core temperature rather than the body surface temperature. Yet, like the skin temperature receptors, they detect mainly cold rather than warmth. It is probable that both the skin and the deep body receptors are mainly concerned with preventing hypothermia, which is a condition in which the body temperature drops to a very low level and the body cannot maintain the normal physiologic temperature around 37 degrees Celsius. Hypothermia can be fatal in very cold areas, and thus it is obvious that the body is looking out majorly for decreases in temperature in order to prevent hypothermia than to detect the rise in temperature. And thus, cold sensing neurons are more numerous than the heat sensing ones. Next, we look into the posterior hypothalamus integrates the central and the peripheral temperature sensory signals. Even though many temperature sensory signals arise in the peripheral receptors, these signals contribute to body temperature control mainly through the hypothalamus. The area of the hypothalamus that they stimulate is located bilaterally in the posterior hypothalamus, approximately at the level of the mammillary bodies. The temperature sensory signals from the anterior hypothalamic preoptic area are also transmitted into this posterior hypothalamic area. Here, the signals from the preoptic area and the signals from elsewhere in the body are combined and integrated to control the heat producing and the heat conserving reactions of the body. Thus, it is the posterior hypothalamus which integrates the various signals coming from the central and the peripheral receptors in order to make a decision to either increase or decrease the temperature of the body accordingly. Next, we look into the neuronal effector mechanisms that decrease or increase body temperature. Here we have a schematic to show how exactly heat production and evaporative heat loss, thus heat production and heat loss of the body occur in reference to various temperatures. We have the plot is calories per second lost or gained versus the temperature of the head in degrees Celsius. If we follow the blue line, we can see evaporative heat loss is at a very minute level till 37 degrees Celsius. Just as the core temperature exceeds the normal 37 degrees Celsius mark, we can see a very sharp increase in evaporative heat loss. That is, the body is trying its best in order to lose the excess heat produced in order to bring the temperature down to the normal physiologic level. Instead, if we look at the red line, at temperatures higher than 37, that is a normal physiologic temperature, we can see that the heat production has flatlined to a low value. Whereas, as the temperature of our body decreases between the physiologic 37 degrees Celsius, there is a huge increase in heat production. This increases in heat production is mainly in order to raise the temperature of our body back to the 37 degrees Celsius mark. In this particular part, we will look into how exactly this heat production and heat loss is done by the body and how is it regulated. So the first thing we'll look into is temperature decreasing mechanisms when the body is too hot. That is when we follow the blue line. The first of these mechanisms include vasodilation of the skin blood vessels. In almost all areas of the body, the skin blood vessels become intensely dilated when the body is too hot. This is caused by inhibition of the sympathetic centers in the posterior hypothalamus that cause vasoconstriction. Full vasodilation can increase the rate of heat transfer to the skin as much as 8-fold. Next is sweating. The effect of increased body temperature to cause sweating is demonstrated by the blue curve that is shown here, which shows a sharp increase in rate of evaporative heat loss resulting from sweating when the body core temperature rises above the critical level of 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. An additional 1 degree increase in body temperature causes enough sweating to remove 10 times the basal rate of body heat production. Thus, sweating is a major mechanism in order to reduce the heat that is produced by the body. And as we were saying before, sweating has also given higher animals such as humans an evolutionary advantage over lower animals that can only lose heat via panting by heat uh, loss of heat by the air that is expired out of their lungs during the process of panting. Humans, on the other hand, can lose heat even when they are continuing a strenuous exercise without having to stop by the process of sweating. Thus, they can continue strenuous exercise or any other extreme work while not worrying much about the heat generated in the body, because the sweating can essentially make sure that they are losing enough heat in order to they are losing enough heat in order to maintain their body temperature at the correct critical level of 37 degrees Celsius. Next point that helps in temperature decreasing mechanisms is decreasing heat production. The mechanism that cause excess heat production, such as shivering and chemical thermogenesis, are strongly inhibited. Thus, these were the temperature decreasing mechanisms. Next, let us look at the temperature increasing mechanisms when the body is too cold. When the body is too cold, the temperature control system institutes exactly opposite procedures. The mechanisms by which the body responds to cold conditions are skin vasoconstriction throughout the body, which is caused by stimulation of the posterior hypothalamic sympathetic centers. And thus, as we have discussed before, low amount of blood that will pass under the skin will cause low conduction, low heat loss by the blood through the skin. Next is the process of piloerection. Piloerection means hair standing on end. Sympathetic stimulation causes arrested pili muscles attached to hair follicles to contract, which brings the hairs to an upright stance. This is not important for human beings who do not have a thick layer of hair on their body, but in lower animals, upright projection of hairs allows them to entrap a thick layer of insulated air next to the skin, so that transfer of heat to the surroundings is greatly depressed. This is because the air is obviously a very potent vector of heat, and thus a pocket of air around the skin does not allow much heat to be lost from their body. Next is increasing thermogenesis or chemical heat production. Heat production by the metabolic systems is increased by promoting shivering, sympathetic excitation of heat production, and thyroxine secretion. These and thyroxine secretion. Next, we look into the concept of a set point temperature for temperature control. A set point for temperature control. In the figure that we have already discussed, it is clear that a critical core temperature of around 37.1 degrees Celsius or 98.8 degrees Fahrenheit, drastic changes occur in rates of both heat loss and heat production. At temperatures above this level, the rate of heat loss is greater than that of heat production. So the body temperature falls and approaches to the 37.1 degree level, Celsius level. At temperatures below this level, the rate of heat production is greater than that of heat loss. So the body temperature rises and again approaches the 37.1 degrees Celsius level. This crucial temperature level is called the set point of the temperature control mechanism. That is, all the temperature control mechanisms present in our body continually attempt to bring the body temperature back to this set point level. Next, we look at the feedback gain for body temperature control. Feedback gain is a measure of effectiveness of a control system. In the case of body temperature control, it is important for the internal core temperature to change as little as possible. Even though the environmental temperature might change greatly from day to day or even hour to hour. The feedback gain of the temperature control system is equal to the ratio of change in environmental temperature to the change in the body core temperature minus 1. Experiments have shown that the body temperature of humans change about 1 degree Celsius for each 25 to 30 degrees Celsius change in environmental temperature. Therefore, the feedback gain of total mechanism for body temperature control averages about 27, which is calculated as easily as 28 by 1 minus 1, which is extremely high gain for a biological control system, which when compared to the baroreceptor arterial pressure control system has a feedback gain of less than 2. That compared to the temperature control feedback gain tells us that the temperature control feedback gain is very large, and the temperature is very minutely determined and regulated by the body. It is also to note that we have already discussed control systems and feedback gain in the very first lecture of our course. And if we are having problem recalling how exactly feedback gain helps in measuring how a feedback cycle works, we can always refer back to that particular video. Next, we look at abnormalities of body temperature regulation. The abnormalities that we will look into first is fever. Fever, which means a body temperature above the usual range of normal, can be caused by abnormalities in the brain itself or by toxic substances that affect the temperature regulating centers. Some causes of fever and also of subnormal body temperatures are represented in this particular figure. They may include bacterial diseases, brain tumors, and environmental conditions that may terminate in heat stroke. So, what exactly causes a fever in a person? The fever is caused by resetting the hypothalamic temperature regulating center in febrile diseases, which is essentially an effect of pyrogens. Many proteins break down products of proteins and certain other substances, especially lipopolysaccharide toxins released from bacterial cell membranes, can cause the set point of the hypothalamic thermostat to rise. Substances that cause this effect are called pyrogens. As thus they essentially change the set point temperature that is maintained by the hypothalamus. Once that occurs, the body, the temperature regulating systems of our body think that the new set point is what they have to raise the temperature to, and thus instead of a normal, or instead of them maintaining normal 37 degrees Celsius temperature, they think that they have to maintain the increased set point that is around 38 degrees Celsius in case of fever. And thus the body systems themselves raise the temperature as an effect of the pyrogens. Pyrogens released from toxic bacteria or those released from degenerating body tissue cause fever during disease conditions. When the set point of hypothalamic temperature regulating center becomes higher than normal, all mechanisms for raising the body temperature are brought into play, which include heat conservation and increased heat production systems. Within a few hours after the set point has been increased, the body temperature also approaches this level, and thus the patient now experiences a fever. In this particular schematic, there are given other reasons that might cause a fever. This can be obviously febrile diseases or hard exercise, or can also include heat stroke and brain lesions. In the case of febrile diseases, the temperature regulation efficiency in febrile diseases, health and work are dysregulated, and even higher temperatures, which can be due to heat strokes or brain lesions, the temperature regulation is seriously impaired. Similarly, when the temperature of our body decreases a lot, it can, at around 90 degree Fahrenheit level, the temperature regulation feedback mechanism is impaired, and even below that, the temperature regulation is completely lost. And thus the mark of around 78 degree Fahrenheit and 114 degree Fahrenheit are constitutively the lower limit and the upper limit of survival. Next, we will look into the characteristics of febrile conditions. The first of these are chills. When the set point of hypothalamic temperature control center is suddenly changed from the normal level to higher than normal level as a result of tissue destruction, pyrogenic substances, or dehydration, the body temperature usually takes several hours to reach the new temperature set point. The figure demonstrates the effect of suddenly increasing the temperature set point to a level of 103 degree Fahrenheit, which is this schematic right here. Because the blood temperature is now less than the set point of the hypothalamic temperature controller, the usual responses that causes elevation of body temperature occurs. And thus we can see when the temperature of the thermostat or the hypothalamus is set via the blue line and it is increased to 103 degree Fahrenheit, the actual body temperature follows suit in just a while and increases to a very high level. But as the hypothalamic temperature is set down to normal, the actual body temperature also falls down and follows the hypothalamic set point temperature and reaches normal. During this period, the person experiences chills and feels extremely cold, even though his or her body temperature may already be above normal. That is this part of the plot where the body temperature starts rising. Also, the skin becomes cold because of vasoconstriction and the person shivers. Thus, all the mechanisms of the body which generate heat are activated in order to help the temperature to rise to the new set point. Next, we look into the crisis or flush characteristic of the febrile condition. If the factor that is causing the high temperature is removed, the set point of the hypothalamic temperature controller will be reduced to a lower value, perhaps even back to normal. In this instance, the body temperature is still 103 degrees Fahrenheit, but the hypothalamus is attempting to regulate the temperature to 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. This situation is analogous to the excessive heating of the anterior hypothalamic preoptic area, which causes intense sweating and sudden development of hot skin because of vasodilation everywhere. And this is the reason why during a fever, when you put your hand onto the patient's forehead, you can feel the temperature is rising. This sudden change of the events in the febrile state is known as crisis, or more appropriately, the flush. Thus, this plot essentially shows us the entire process of the febrile conditions. First, the pyrogens or the various toxins that are present increase the hypothalamic set point to a higher level. The body feels that the body feels that body and the various temperature regulating mechanisms that are present feel that the temperature of the body has dropped, and thus they have to increase the temperature back to the set point of the hypothalamus. This causes various heat producing mechanisms to come into play, which include shivering, chemical heat generation, and vasodilation of blood vessels throughout the body under the skin. All of this work together in order, or rather vasoconstriction of blood vessels present under the skin. All of this together work in order to raise the temperature of the body to the set point of the hypothalamus. And thus, as we can see, the red line follows the blue line and increases in the body temperature also increases. But once at the later portions of a fever condition, once the body has dealt with the bacterial infection or other causes that were increasing the hypothalamic set point, the hypothalamic set point goes back to normal, which is shown in the second part of the picture. Once this happens, that is in the crisis conditions, the various temperature regulating mechanisms of the body once again consider that the set point is that the body temperature has somehow risen high, and the body temperature needs to be brought back to the normal set point level. And thus various heat loss mechanisms such as sweating and vasodilation of the blood vessels present under the skin occur, which increase the skin temperature, but essentially cause a huge loss of heat, which can even be felt when the person touches the patient's skin, especially the forehead, as we normally do. And thus, in the crisis conditions, vasodilation and sweating occur in order to have the excess here, in order to lose the excess heat, so that the bad body temperature goes back to normal set point. Next is the last thing that we'll look into is the mechanism of action of pyrogens in causing fever, which is essentially a role of interleukin 1. When bacteria or breakdown products of bacteria are present in the tissues or in the blood, they are phagocytized by the blood leukocytes, by tissue macrophages, and by large granular killer lymphocytes. The process of which we have already discussed in previous slides. Please refer back to them if the words such as phagocytosis or macrophages seem to not be familiar to you. All these cells digest the bacterial products and then release substance known as interleukin 1, also called leukocyte pyrogen or endogenous pyrogens, into the body fluids. The interleukin 1, on reaching the hypothalamus, immediately activates the processes to produce fever. Interleukin 1 causes fever by first inducing formation of one of the prostaglandins, mainly prostaglandin E2 or a similar substance which acts on the hypothalamus to elicit the fever reaction. Thus, this is essentially a feedback loop that occurs here. A bacterial infection triggers the release, the phagocytosis of various bacteria, which releases the various immune cells, which now release interleukin 1. Interleukin 1 is an endogenous pyrogen because it is produced inside the body by the body itself and is not a toxic chemical that is produced by foreign organisms. Interleukin 1 will act on the hypothalamus in order to increase the hypothalamic set point via prostaglandins such as prostaglandins E2. And thus, when the hypothalamic set point temperature increases and the body temperature also increases along with it, this causes the bacterial infection to be this helps the body to fight the bacterial infection, because obviously the bacteria will not be able to survive at higher temperatures, and thus which in turn decreases the amount of interleukin 1, and thus the whole feedback loop causes the hypothalamic set point to drop back down to the normal level. So this is all we had for today. These are the references for these slides, which is the chapter 73 of the textbook of medical physiology by Arthur C. Guyton, the 11th edition. I thank you for listening to this video.